The gospel reading comes from Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, verses 19 through 31. And as we prepare to read this particular text, we should ask ourselves, who's listening? That's an important question really to ask about a number of the texts that we've been reading from this section of Luke in the past few weeks. As soon as we're clearly told that Jesus is headed to Jerusalem with full awareness of what will happen to him there, the death that awaits him there, we're also told of the kind of people that are following him and that he's interacting with. So in the 14th chapter, we're told about the crowds that he speaks to, and then we're told specifically that he addresses his disciples with some very hard sayings about their loyalties and the choices they'll have to make as they continue to follow him as disciples toward Jerusalem. At the beginning of the 15th chapter, we're told that Jesus was eating with sinners and tax collectors, going in and enjoying hospitality at their homes, sitting down together with them. And we're told that the Pharisees and other religious leaders were really grumbling amongst themselves as they watched Jesus do that. And so immediately after being told that, we're given the parables of the lost and found. The woman who loses one coin and searches for it, the shepherd who loses one sheep and leaves 99 to go in search of that one sheep, and then the story of the prodigal son. And this emphasis on the rejoicing of God in heaven over one sinner who repents. It definitely takes on a new meaning as we remember who it is that's listening to Jesus as he talks about these things. Here in the 16th chapter, remember we had that very peculiar parable last week about the dishonored stewards, and at the end of that, Jesus said, you cannot serve both God and wealth, or both God and mammon. And then we're told immediately after that, that the Pharisees, who were lovers of money, heard all this, and they ridiculed him. And it's in light of those Pharisees listening that way that Jesus moves on to tell the next parable that we're going to read this morning. But who's listening? Who's listening in the text as we read it? Who's listening in the community that Luke wrote his gospel to? Who's in the church across the centuries listening as the text and the stories are read again and again? But perhaps most important of all is who's listening today? Who are you as you sit here in these pews and listen to the text being read once again? There are all these different layers of who's listening. And each person that's listening brings meaning to the text in a unique way. So reading from Luke's Gospel, chapter 16, beginning in verse 19. There was a rich man who was dressed in purple and fine linen, and who'd feasted sumptuously every day. And at his gate lay a poor man named Lazarus, covered with sores, who longed to satisfy his hunger with what fell from the rich man's table. Even the dogs would come and lick his sores. The poor man died and was carried away by the angels to be with Abraham. The rich man also died and was buried. In Hades, where he was being tormented, he looked up and saw Abraham far away with Lazarus by his side. He called out, "Father Abraham, have mercy on me, and send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in agony in these flames." But Abraham said, "Child, remember that during your lifetime you received your good things, and Lazarus in like manner evil things. But now he is comforted here, and you are in agony. Besides all this, between you and us a great chasm has been fixed, so that those who might want to pass from here to you cannot do so, and no one can cross from there to us." He said, "Then, Father, I beg you, send him to my father's house, for I have 5 brothers. that he may warn them so that they will not also come into this place of torment. Abraham replied, they have Moses and the prophets. They should listen to them. He said, no, Father Abraham, but if someone goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He said to them, if they do not listen to Moses and the prophets, neither will they be convinced, even if someone rises from the dead. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Let us pray. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable in thy sight. O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Who are you going to listen to? That's the question I've been thinking about, not really about this morning, whether or not you'll listen to me. I'm sort of wondering who you're going to listen to tomorrow in the political debate. Who are you going to listen to? You can start listening at 9:30 if you'd like to. The coverage apparently is going to start that early and go all the way all day long until the debate itself. That's even worse than the Super Bowl now, isn't it? I don't think they start that early. Who are you going to listen to? Truth is, I don't think you'll be listening to much of anybody. I don't think most of us will really be listening. Polls tell us we already have our minds made up. What's the point of this debate business? The debates, polls say, don't really move people one way or the other. You're going to hear what you want to hear. You've already made up your mind. Who are you listening to? I think there's a lot of truth to that. I know I find that there's truth in that for myself. Who are you going to listen to? You know, you have to choose what channel you want to watch it on, right? If you're going to watch it and listen to. So you're going to choose the channel where they're saying things that you like to have them say. Who are you going to listen to? ABC, NBC, PBS, CNN, Fox? You're not really going to be listening, are you? You're going to choose to just listen to the people that are saying what you want to hear. Who are you going to listen to? With all of this information going on, I don't think that there's going to be a whole lot of listening going on. Real listening, where you have to really be engaged with people who perhaps think differently than you do, aren't like you, whose life circumstances are different from yours. I don't mean to be cynical this morning, but I wonder how much listening we do anytime. We have so many choices, it's just too easy not to listen and just kind of hear whoever we think is saying the things that we want to hear. Who are you going to listen to? We have so many choices that we can just make changes whenever we want to. You go to one doctor, the doctor doesn't say what you want to hear, so what do? You go get a second opinion. You go to another doctor and then a third doctor until what? Until you hear somebody say what you want to hear. Who are you listening to? We have all these choices. You go into one store and they say, well, this is what you need. And then what do? You go down to another store to see if they have what you want. When Walk said this morning, and I'm so deeply grateful for his sharing the things that he did, but when he said, so many years ago, Nancy and I chose this church, immediately a fear struck in my heart. Does that mean that tomorrow they can choose a different church if I say the wrong things? Oh my gosh, who are you listening to? Who are you going to listen to? Are we listening to anybody? Did you watch any of the protests from Charlotte this week in the evenings? Was anybody listening in the midst of all that? Just seemed like everybody was screaming at each other, protesters screaming at protesters, protesters screaming at police, police there doing their job. Were they listening in the midst of that? How could they listen in the midst of that? Who was listening to who? And then all these news commentators running around in the midst of all that talking. Who was listening to who? And yet we're told again and again and again, and I believe that there's truth in it, that so much of this turmoil and so much of this anxiety and so much of this pain which we are experiencing in our country, and which different parts and peoples in our country are experiencing in powerful ways, is because nobody's listening. It's because nobody is really hearing the pain that they're experiencing. Nobody is really listening to life as they experience. Nobody is really listening to what they have to go through day in and day out. Who are you going to listen to? Well, if someone came back from the dead, you would probably listen to them, wouldn't you? I would. What would you be listening for, though? Think about that. What would you be listening for? Is it true? Is there something there beyond death? Can you tell me? You'd be listening for that answer. You might be listening for, what lies ahead for me? Can you tell me? Can you give me that answer? You might be listening for that. What would you be listening for? Can you tell us how all this is going to turn out? Can you give me some help here with things that I'm worried about? You might be listening for that. It's so interesting to think about who's listening and who isn't listening, even in this parable, in this text that Jesus gives us here in this story. There was a rich man. He wore wonderful purple, fancy clothes and feasted sumptuously every day. And there was a poor man. And he was lying right outside the gate without anything to eat, with sores on his body. The dogs would come and lick. He gladly would have eaten even the scraps that fell from the table. But nobody was listening. Nobody was watching. Nobody was looking. And so when they die, the contrast that seemed to exist between them in life now is reversed and becomes a very different kind of contrast, still a stark contrast, but just exactly reversed from the way they experienced it in life. Now Lazarus, the poor man, is being comforted as he lies closely in the bosom of Abraham, while the rich man is in torment and agony and flames. Who's listening? Father Abraham, the rich man calls out, send Lazarus who should do whatever I tell Lazarus to do. I am the rich man after all. Send Lazarus to dip his finger in the water and come put it on my tongue. Sorry, Lazarus isn't listening. Maybe the chasm is too great, the gulf too great. Abraham says, can't get across that anymore. It's hard to listen with that big a gulf here anymore. Sorry about that. So the rich man says, well, at least send him to warn my brothers. No, they won't listen to him. They had the Bible. They had the scriptures. But is anybody listening? We have the Bible. We have scriptures all over the place. Don't we have Bibles in every pew? Is anybody listening? We have Bibles on every table in our home. We have Bibles where we keep recipes sometimes. We have Bibles where we have birth announcements. We have Bibles with newspaper clippings. But is anybody listening? They have the Bible, but nobody's listening, Abraham said. Well, send somebody from the dead. If you send somebody from the dead, they'll listen. No, won't even listen to that, Abraham says. Won't even listen if someone rose from the dead. You get the joke here that Luke's working with, don't you? Jesus is telling this parable. Jesus who, rose from the dead is telling this parable. Is anybody listening? Is anybody in Luke's church listening? This story about this person who rose from the dead? which they've come together to praise and worship in their own communities and read and remember his stories again, so that perhaps he would now, even his living presence, speak again to them. Is anybody listening? Can anything be done? Is the gulf still so great that no one can go back and forth? It's a little bit like the end of Luke's gospel, where you remember two of Jesus' disciples are walking home after Easter, and they're so disappointed, their hopes are so dashed, they're so down, and a stranger walks with them. The stranger is Jesus. And the stranger says to them, "Tell me, what's happening?" And they say to him, "Are you the only one who doesn't know what happened?" And then they recount the events of Good Friday. They recount what had been said about someone rising from the dead, but who's listening? Apparently they aren't even looking. Apparently they can't really look. Their eyes are kept from recognizing Jesus, the one who did rise from the dead and now is in their midst. Who's listening? Who's looking? Maybe this parable wants to help us remember one thing. Don't forget to listen in order to know the purpose and meaning of life. Or maybe we can just change it a little bit and say, don't forget to look and see who's there, so that you will know and understand the nature and character of life. Helen shared this word with the children, Ubuntu, which is a Zulu word, and as we've heard it described and used before, as I remember it, it's really a response to someone else who says in Zulu, "I see you." And therefore, having been acknowledged by someone else, having been told that you exist, that you are seen, that you are understood, then you reply to that person, "I am because you are." And there's something in that seeing, and there's something in that hearing, and there's something in that noticing, and there's something in that taking account of another human life which is there before you, which helps us all to remember and be humans as God intends us to be. Don't lose sight. Don't lose sight. And don't forget to listen. Ruby Sales is an aging civil rights activist who has continued the work of the civil rights movement from the early 1960s, which she was a part of as a young person throughout her life, in and out, working, doing many different things. And in an extensive interview with Krista Tippett on her program On Being, she reflected on what that has meant for her life and where she has been and what she has done and what she has learned. She tells many wonderful stories. We're reminded how, as a teenager, in Fort Defiance, Alabama, she and some of her friends were arrested for protesting at a grocery store where her parents had been cheated. And after being released from jail, they went to the grocery store to try and buy some sodas for some of the other activists and freedom workers who were there, when a young man shot at them, shot directly at Ruby Sales. But there was a white Episcopal divinity student there from Massachusetts with them. He immediately pulled Ruby out of the way and stepped forward and took the bullet on her behalf. He died. I see you. I hear you. She's dedicated much of her life to working in his memory, working for human rights, working for civil rights, working for justice for all people, in memory of this one who saw her and gave his life for her. She described the significance and the importance of the church and the church in which she was brought up in, and the grounding and the understanding that it gave her about who she was. The song, she said, that she learned and was taught as a child. She said by the time she was 7 years old, she knew 50 songs, all of the words which she could sing without missing a beat. I love everyone, I love everyone, I love everyone, I love everyone in my heart. In my heart, I love everyone. It just became part of her being. That song which also goes on to say, not only an affirmation of love, but a defiance of hate. I love everyone and you can't make me hate. You can't make me hate. You can't make me hate anyone in my heart. She talks about a time, though, when she left the church and she wandered away from this upbringing. She wandered away from this gift of a tradition and a heritage which her parents had given her, in which they said, even though you may be treated by the rest of the world as a commodity, as something that's disposable, you have essential worth and value to which you cannot be taken away. You're precious. You're precious in God's sight, and you're precious in our sight, and you're loved. She said she wandered away from that understanding, from that grounding in the beloved community. And it became very hard for her to make her way. Krista Tippett asked her, well, how did you get back? How did you come back? And she said to her, well, one thing happened. At one point, I was getting my locks washed, her long hair. I was getting my locks washed, and the person who was washing my locks, the locker, that person's daughter came into the store, a young teenage African-American woman. And she sat down, and I could tell that she was just spent. She was just worn out. She didn't have much life left in her. Even had sores on her bodies, even had bandages and things covering up the wounds where the kind of life she had been living was evident. And Ruby said, I looked at her and it just came to me to ask her, where is it that you're hurting? Shelley, tell me, where is it that you're hurting? And that triggered something, and Shelley then began to just open up and share so many things that had gone on and happened in her life that she'd never been able to tell her mother who was standing there washing Ruby's hair. She began to tell her about the incest and the abuse and the discrimination and so many other things that just made her hurt. And Ruby says, in that seeing and in that asking and in that hearing, that listening, they all began to make their way back to this foundation of the beloved community that reminded them of who they were, where they were going, and what they needed to do. Don't lose sight of the life that really is life. Timothy tells us. Look who's there. Look who's listening. Fred Craddock tells the story of a time when he brought a guest to his house to spend the night. His wife, Nettie Craddock, helped out and had the guest wait while they were making dinner together, and the guest was in the living room, Fred said. As Fred said, he sat down himself with the newspaper and started to read it, but he noticed that his guest sat down with his children and started to play with them on the floor and ask about the games that they had, and even started to do some new games with them. And Fred watched for a minute and asked himself, how long has it been since I came home from work and got down on the floor and enjoyed playing with the kids and even taught them a new game? Fred said, I felt judged by my own guest's action. And then following the dinner, the guest said, Mrs. Craddock, I certainly appreciated that meal. That was a wonderful meal. And Fred said he tried to remember when was the last time he had ever said that to Nettie. I think it was 1949. He said, I felt judged by the guest once again. And then he said the guest after dinner went out for a walk, and then when he came back in, he said, oh, those are some nice folks, some new neighbors of yours I met down the street. I met a Mr. Young and his wife who have just come here from Korea, from Seoul, a very nice couple, a wonderful couple. And Fred said to himself, well, I had heard there were some Koreans that had moved in the neighborhood, but I didn't know who they were. I had never seen them. I had never spoken to them. What were their names? I felt judged again. Just a familiar pattern that we go through every day. Come home, read the paper, eat supper. And then someone else comes in, and they look, and they see, and you remember. You remember what it is you're to do. We come here Sunday after Sunday after Sunday after Sunday. Maybe we don't know why sometimes. Maybe we don't know what we're listening for. Maybe we don't know who we're listening to. But just maybe it is that God will one day say, as God says every day, tell me where it hurts. Tell me where it hurts. And when you hear that, then maybe you'll be able to see who else is there, right at the gate, right outside the door. You'll remember who's listening. Amen.